Outside of full electric startup brands like Tesla and Rivian, Volvo has arguably been one of the most aggressive companies at pushing towards a zero-emissions future, but also pragmatically pushing towards a reduced emissions present. And that's what makes Volvo's push towards electrification different than Mercedes, BMW, and Audi. Those three German luxury brands definitely have a decent number of EVs, both in terms of sales volume and in terms of just sheer models available. Volvo, this year, now has 2 EVs. But Volvo has been pushing hard at the emissions reduction portion of this in the meantime. A full quarter of their sales last year in the United States were plug-in hybrids. In California, that was about 50%. Seriously high volumes of plug-in hybrids in Europe as well. That is by far the largest share of plug-in hybrids versus regular sales of any luxury brand anywhere in the world. And that's part of Volvo's electrification push. Move everybody to hybrids, move everybody to plug-in hybrids, then make the transition to full battery electric vehicles. And that for Volvo is coming very, very soon. By the end of 2025, they want half of their volume to be fully electrified, whether that's a plug-in hybrid or battery electric vehicle. And by 2030, every Volvo will just have a plug like this brand new C40. Volvo isn't just planning on making tailpipe emissions drop to zero by 2030, they're also planning on making their manufacturing climate neutral sooner, by 2025, and make the entire company from cradle to grave net zero by 2040. Those are very aggressive climate goals, and it already looks like Volvo is well on their way. They have already reduced emissions totally in their vehicle lineup and manufacturing by about 25% versus 2018. That's one of the biggest moves in the industry. Now let's get to what we're all here to talk about, the sexy new Volvo C40. The full name of this one is the 2022 Volvo C40 Recharge Twin Ultimate, which is quite a mouthful. Recharge means that it has a plug. Twin refers to the twin electric motors. They're identical front and rear. Ultimate refers to the trim level, and that's the only way the C40 is going to come in the United States at the moment. If you want a less expensive full electric Volvo, that would be the XC40, the close cousin to this model. Versus the last XC40 that I drove, you'll definitely notice a few differences up front. We have the classic Volvo Thor's Hammer headlights here. It's very distinctive, but the headlights are different. These are full LEDs, and these are the first pixel LED headlights in the Volvo lineup. Now, rather unfortunately, due to the silly lighting laws in the United States, these will not do all the fancy things that they will do in Europe, but that is likely coming soon because the United States has finally decided to update the headlight laws here, and these should be able to do all those tricks once Volvo finally reads the final legislation, once it actually gets done, and then Volvo can make the changes. That should be over-the-air updatable, by the way. Down lower, we have some slim LED fog lights, and then you'll notice that the grille here has changed versus the XC40. It's definitely a little bit smoother, a little bit sleeker. It still has sort of a grille profile to let you know that this is a Volvo, but it definitely is more in keeping with a lot of the new EVs that we're seeing out there. Obviously, not a lot of cooling is required for an EV, so that's why that part's blanked off, and then we just have a cooling vent here, and then a small one right there as well. If it wasn't obvious already from the deleted X in the name and the business up front, party in the back style of the C40, this is Volvo's first 5-door coupe crossover. At 174.8 inches long, it's half an inch longer than the XC40, on which it is very closely based. And the big difference happens sort of in this area, rearward, where we get this much more sloping style that is much more aerodynamic. That's the big reason that Volvo went this way. And it's also the reason that when you look at this profile without all the styling bits, this is the same basic shape we find in pretty much every modern EV. But interestingly, Volvo still decided that the C40 should have some off-road capability. There's actually an off-road mode in the infotainment system, and we have 7 inches of ground clearance, which is considerably more than we find in the average EV for this price. If you need a little bit more, of course, there's the XC40 that will give you 8.3 inches of ground clearance. Remember that this is in the same price range as a Ford Mustang Mach-E, perhaps an Ioniq 5, an EV6, and of course the new Genesis GV60, and all of those will have considerably less ground clearance. The Mustang Mach-E is so low that it actually has less ground clearance than a real Mustang with a V8 under the hood. In a surprising twist, Volvo went with a staggered tire setup, 255s in the rear, 235s up front. This is a 20-inch aerodynamic wheel, and unlike some of the aero wheels in the luxury segment, these black portions are not plastic. That's all part of the alloy wheel design. Logically, the biggest change versus the XC40 happens in the rear, where we have a bit more of a sport back or lift back profile rather than a more upright hatchback. We still have very distinctive LED taillights that really accentuate the strong shoulder design that we find in every modern Volvo. This one has some brakes in the light pipe as it goes up towards the roof section. We also get amber turn signals, and they're sequential, which is really cool. Amber turn signals are something that Volvo has for some reason deleted in a lot of North American cars, and I really wish they would bring them back because it makes it a lot easier to tell exactly what the car in front of you is doing when they're amber. These are, again, full LED units. We have parking sensors well integrated down there at the bottom, and then some black plastic sections right around here, but not encompassing the entire opening for the lift gate. Sorry, the button is right there. This little section right there just helps connect the tail lamps. This does mean that if you have dogs or other animals getting in the vehicle, they can scratch these outer portions, but if they jump up right there in the middle, they won't scratch anything that is too hard to replace. From this angle, you can really see the light pipe and the way that it curves up there towards the top of the hatch. If I open the hatch, you'll notice that this section now becomes the turn signal. This upper element right in here, interestingly, is only used for the turn signal when the hatch is open. That's due to some peculiar lighting laws that require a specific amount of light to come out for a turn signal. The backup lights, they're very discreetly hidden over here on the side. Volvo's small car platform was designed from the ground up to accommodate electrification in the form of not just full electric vehicles like this C40, but also plug-in hybrids, regular gasoline vehicles, mild hybrids, and full hybrids as well. That's one of the reasons we find a small front trunk under here, because this platform was designed to accommodate a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine transversely under here, and obviously if you get the electric version, we have some extra space. This front trunk is actually a little bit bigger than it would otherwise appear because under this little divider where we have the EVSE, etc. there is the Canna-Fix-A-Flat and the tire inflator. You could pull out that foam divider and get a little bit more room here, enough for a laptop bag or something like that. Now, speaking of EVSEs, this is one really nice touch in every Volvo with a plug, whether we're talking about a plug-in hybrid or a full electric vehicle. They come with an appropriate EVSE that is dual voltage. The one in the battery electric vehicles is a little bit beefier. It will charge at 40 amps, so it includes a 50 amp dryer style plug right there, I guess, or RV plug, whatever you want to call that. 40 amps is not the max charge rate for the C40 or the XC40, but it is close, and it means if you don't want to worry about what EVSE to buy, one comes with a car that should be just fine. It also includes an end for charging from a regular 15 amp 120 volt socket. This is the only plug that you get with a wide variety of brand new EVs, if one comes with the EV at all. Now, if you get the plug-in hybrid Volvo, then we get a slightly smaller dual voltage EVSE. That one is designed to charge at around 16 amps 220. Like the XC40, the C40 is based around a semi-skateboard battery pack. The battery pack extends from right around here in the vehicle to just about the front axle or so, with cutouts for the rear passenger footwells to make it feel a little bit more normal and give the rear passenger a bit more room, while still giving you a relatively compact body and high ground clearance. When you take a look at a lot of full skateboard vehicles where you don't have those cutouts, you'll notice that there's a huge portion of the body that is occupied by the battery pack underneath. So they may look like they have a reasonable amount of ground clearance. You may be sitting a little higher off the ground, but they don't actually have that kind of ground clearance. And that was Volvo's solution in order to do that. About 75 kilowatt hours of this battery pack is usable. Expect a bigger battery pack in Volvo's next EV. Unlike many luxury EVs, which have a more powerful electric motor in the rear and a smaller one up front, in this one, we have twin identical motors, 201 horsepower a pop, 243 pound-feet, giving us a total of 402 horsepower. Now, as we see in a lot of EVs, this will direct more power to the rear axle for sportier driving if you're driving it hard. Until you're commanding all 402 horsepower, then it's going to be 50-50, obviously. But the vehicle can also bias power front or rear wherever it's needed to improve traction, improve efficiency, and of course improve mild off-roading performance as well. EPA range comes in at 226 miles. That is 3 miles better than the XC40, mainly because of this styling going on right here. But the MPGe rating at 87 MPGe, it's not the highest. I'm not entirely clear if that's because Volvo has been really conservative in their MPGe and range calculations, because as we saw in the XC40, it definitely gets or exceeds its EPA range. So I suspect in real-world efficiency tests, this is going to be doing better than 87 MPGe. Charging happens back here behind door number 1. We have a CCS charge connector for 150 kW DC fast charging, and then there's an onboard 11 kilowatt level 2 charger. The basic seat design is shared with the XC40, so we find a multi-way power driver's seat, power front passenger seat as well, with the identical range of motion here, 4-way adjustable lumbar support, and a manual extending thigh cushion. There's a 2-position memory over there for the driver, and we have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty large range of motion. Front headroom doesn't really appear to be too affected by the C40 conversion. It does appear to be just a tiny bit lower depending on the spec you're looking at, but sitting here comfortably, I still have about 4 inches of headroom left, so the front section is definitely suitable for taller drivers. As you might imagine, things are a little bit tighter back here in the C40 versus the XC40, but better than I had expected. If I put my head right back here to the headrest, my head is touching the ceiling, but it's not as tight as I had expected. And if I'm sitting in a more normal seating position, I would say my hair is just sort of barely brushing the ceiling there. If I move over to the middle seat, This is a little bit higher off the ground, and headroom is definitely a bit more limited here, but this is still a pretty accommodating and spacious interior. This front seat's almost all the way back in its tracks. You can see I still have about 4 inches of legroom left. Although the C40 is technically a subcompact luxury crossover in the US, you might be able to fit a rear-facing child seat back here depending on exactly where your front seat position was. It's barely noticeable in the camera, but as you'll see in a bit, all C40s come with this glass roof, but because of the location of the glass roof, it doesn't help rear seat headroom. The C40 comes only one way at the moment, so everybody's going to get a rear armrest with cup holders, rear heated seats, and twin air vents back there in the center console as well. The rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion, and there's also a ski pass-through right there in the middle seat position. Behind the standard power hatch, we have, oddly enough, a little bit more cargo room than we find in the XC60, or at least according to Volvo's specifications. You can see it is a pretty accommodating cargo area, but that hatch is a little bit more raked than it is in the regular XC. Getting under the load floor is easy. We have a nice little handle there. You can lift this up into this position, have access to a little bit of additional storage space right there, and then there's some grocery bag holders right there. Those are a really nice touch because they just fold flat into the floor. You can definitely put a lot of large flat items under the load floor because that goes all the way back there to the rear seats. That's handy because the cargo cover is one of these hard variety, but it will fit completely under the load floor. You just pop it in there upside down and then close the floor up. Although this might change, at the moment every C40 is going to be identically equipped. In here we have a large panoramic glass roof. Again, this one does not open, and it does not go quite over the rear passengers' heads. So unlike some EVs, the glass roof is not improving rear seat headroom. The driver and front passenger get height adjustable shoulder belts and two-way adjustable headrests. The C40 is going to be the only Volvo in the lineup with no leather option, but expect that to continue as Volvo pushes towards a more sustainable future. This is an imitation leather product on the side of the seats and an imitation suede insert. This doesn't exactly feel like leather. It kind of feels a little bit more wetsuity, and then we have different fabric inserts on the sides and then on the face of the seat as well. In other Volvo vehicles, you can also get a more sustainable wool choice, which is a really cool thing. Hopefully that comes to the XC40 and C40 at some time. Moving over to the doors, we have lots of soft touch materials and the same design statement that we found in the XC40 when it launched, only here we have blue inserts. I think this was a really novel design choice by Volvo to do this in their small vehicles. This is a carpet insert. It's actually not plastic, so it has a more premium feel than plastic, but it's a lot less expensive than a slush molded plastic or of course a stitched material. In terms of their shape, all these parts are related to the XC40, but you can see that the texture and the patterns are a little bit different for the C40. Volvo has also tweaked the ambient lighting in here. Rather unfortunately, I haven't been able to see this at night. Just under that trim panel on the passenger side, we find a pretty decently sized glove compartment. You'd have no problem fitting larger tablet computers in there. And you can see from this angle that the carpet and the doors match. In the middle of the dashboard, we have Volvo's latest infotainment software. This is spreading across the lineup. So for 2022, I should say late 2022, most of the new Volvos will get this exact same software. It's based around Google Automotive. Volvo designed the software to look familiar if you've driven a Volvo in the past. We have the same sort of 4-quadrant home screen there. There are some extra widgets versus what we have seen before in some of Volvo's electrified vehicles. So we have this new range assistant screen right here. There's also a home screen option where you can install apps and have the little widgets right there. The one thing missing from this software continues to be Apple CarPlay, although SiriusXM is finally here. Volvo is promising that CarPlay is going to come a little bit later in 2022. However, they are a little behind there, and they have been promising CarPlay for quite some time. For some shoppers, the integration of an internet-connected Google Assistant and Google Mapping interface is going to be enough to keep you from worrying about CarPlay, at least for the moment. You can command a wide variety of different things in the system, like your temperature, seat heating, things like that. And you can also just say, "Hey Google, navigate me to San Jose." You see it pulls that up right there. And it handles voice commands very naturally. The way that you can interact with the system, the way that you can request things is very natural. Now let's take a look at the way it handles charging on your longer routes. Pretty easy here. You just click the Add Charging Stop, and it's automatically going to tell you where you need to go. This is a 477-mile route, and because my battery is maybe about half charged right now, it tells me that I need to make 3 charging stops. It has planned them out. I'm going to get to this Electrify America station with 8% battery. I then have to spend 23 minutes there. Then I stop at this one. I'm going to be 12% when I get there, charge up. This one, 12%. Then I can kick it on into San Jose with a 30% charge. It is nice that it doesn't just take you there at 0. Volvo has planned that last charging spell in there, so that way you'll get to your destination with a little bit of oomph left. Below the infotainment system, we find the same sort of button bank we find in pretty much every other Volvo. It includes the defogger and defroster controls, track forward, backward, volume knob, and play and pause button. One oddity, however, There's a blank right here where the start button would be in the normal XC40. I really wish Volvo had plugged that up a little bit nicer, or just given us a start button. This is one of the new crop of EVs where if you want to start the vehicle, you have to get in the driver's seat, put your foot on the brake, and just put it into drive. When you hit the park button and get out, it'll automatically turn itself off. But sometimes there are times where maybe you have a passenger in the vehicle and you want to leave the air conditioning on. That gets a little bit tricky here. Below that button bank, we have a 12-volt power outlet, 2 USB-C ports. One will interface with the media system, Qi wireless charging mat right there, 2 big cup holders. You can see I have my smartphone in there. Volvo's joystick-style shifter, not a crystal one like we find in the bigger Volvos. It's a double tap shifter, so we pull twice backwards for drive, push forward twice for reverse. Park is that button right there. Oddly enough, there is no B mode like we find in the plug-in hybrids to instantly ask for a little bit more regen. So it does make toggling in and out of the regen modes a little bit trickier. Speaking of drive modes, you adjust things up here in the infotainment system. The only drive mode we have is off-road mode that directs the traction control and stability control to send power where it's needed. And then down here, sort of like a drive mode, we have the one pedal drive on-off, and you can adjust the steering feel in 2 different settings, firm or not firm. Between the front seats, we find a padded armrest that opens to reveal a decently sized storage compartment, and we continue to have a removable little trash can. There are other third-party accessories you can snap in and out of there, or you could just remove it if you wanted access to that entire storage area, but you should know that it's never going to get covered off. It's always going to be open if you just remove that little trash can or bin, or really whatever you want to use that as. On the driver's side, we have a just over 12-inch full LCD instrument cluster. You can see it's curved around the edges there. The theme of this display does not really change much. You can either turn the map in the center on or off, and that will expand the power gauge over here on the right side and the speedometer on the left side. And you can bring up a trip computer readout, but that's basically it. One nice touch is that the map interface in the instrument cluster is the same one over here. It looks identical and will give you the turn-by-turn route directions as well as a moving map display. The steering wheel is similar but not identical to the larger Volvos. It has a slightly different airbag here and slightly different button banks. The controls for the adaptive cruise control, they're over here on the left side. That also turns on and off Volvo's aggressive steering assistance system. Over here we have volume up, down, track forward, backward, and the button that does control that one little pop-up menu right there in that LCD cluster. You move around like that and then close it with that center button. Since I spoke about mild off-roading earlier, and I am a little off the beaten path here, let's talk about that ability in the C40 first. This has, again, symmetrical motors, so it can send just as much power to the front as to the rear, and in the off-road mode, which you can, again, dig around in here and engage, it's going to try and balance that power a little bit more equitably to make sure that you have the optimum traction. In addition to redefining the way the stability and traction control software works, the software also will engage hill descent control, which is going to help regulate your speed in off-camber situations like this and help when one wheel is up in the air, etc. Thanks to the extra ground clearance that we have in the C40, it had absolutely no problem out on this trail, even though it looked a little sketchy at the beginning. The reason I found this a little bit interesting is because I just came from the Subaru Solterra event where we actually did off-roading that was a little bit less rigorous than what I'm doing right here in a C40, and theoretically this is less optimized for this particular task, but it still does an excellent job at it. And that really does put the C40 and the XC40 in a slightly different niche than I had honestly expected. Because this will tackle obstacles like that, and then when you get out on the paved road and floor it, you will go 0 to 60 in 4.2 seconds. That is the quickest run that I recorded today. 4.3 was the slowest, so this is very, very fast. This is faster than the new 455 horsepower plug-in hybrid XC60. And the driving dynamics of the C40 are different as well, because this has a lot of shove on the rear axle. And it's very obvious that if you're driving this harder, Volvo has chosen to bias power a little bit more towards the rear than you might expect. On the other hand, Volvo's tuning of this system is not quite as aggressive as we find in the Polestar lineup. That will definitely give you a little bit more rear end rotation. Unfortunately, I haven't had this at home, so I don't have any 6-0 braking numbers for you, but I suspect this might be a little bit lower than the last XC40 that I tested because of the tire choices and just the design of the suspension in the C40. This is definitely targeting a sportier dynamic. It has a sportier feel, but not an uncomfortable one versus the XC40. And that's another thing that makes the C40 unique. This is not as firm as a Mach-E or anything really in the mainstream segment outside of the new Ioniq and the Kia EV6. The average Tesla is very firmly sprung, and if you're looking for an EV that is more comfortable for your daily drive, especially if you live in most of America where the pavement isn't perfect, then this is going to be an excellent option. I actually think ride quality in here is substantially similar to the Kia, the Hyundai, and likely the new Genesis, although I have not driven the GV60 yet. The likely reason that this is more comfortable is simply that Volvo has more suspension travel to play with. This vehicle was designed for a high-riding suspension like we find in the XC40 and for more rugged uses like we find in that XC40. So there's just simply more suspension motion to damp the vehicle, and that's really important when we're talking about big battery cars. When you have a car that weighs well over 4,000 pounds and you only have a few inches to damp suspension motions in, you get the firm bouncy ride that we find in the Mach-E, the Model Y, etc. I actually think the ride quality in here is a little bit better than the Jaguar I-Pace even, and that includes the I-Pace with the adaptive air suspension. One thing to keep in mind is that even though the I-Pace will give you just a hair more ground clearance than this in the highest ride height mode, ride quality in the high ride height mode is pretty poor, and that only applies at lower speeds. It will automatically lower itself if you're going the speed that I'm going, and this is always going to be 7 inches off the ground. I think that's pretty logical, of course, because Volvo was really designing these vehicles for use in wintry weather, logically because they were designed in Sweden, and there it gets snow. So if you're worried about snow performance, snow clearance, etc. in an EV, this is going to have a lot less of a worry than most of the other options in this segment. And of course, if you're really worried about it, then you might want the XC40, which gets 1.3 extra inches of clearance. But that lower ride height definitely gives this a sportier feel. We get less body roll, we get less tip and dive if I just romp on the brake pedal. This has a very stable planted feel to it. It also doesn't lift quite as much when you floor it. There's still a reasonable amount of lift. There's no way around that we have this kind of ground clearance, this type of suspension, and this much power combined, but side-to-side motions and braking motions, those are very, very well controlled here. If you want that slightly sportier driving dynamic, another reason to get this over the XC40. It's a little bit difficult to talk about range and efficiency since I haven't been able to drive this at home, but I suspect the EPA average is going to be pretty accurate. 226 according to the EPA for this. The last time we drove an XC40, we actually got a little bit further than its EPA range. I expect that's going to apply right here as well. The main thing seems to be that Volvo's pretty conservative about their power consumption figures. And this has a heat pump. So if you live in a cool climate or a cold climate, this is going to use considerably less energy to heat the cabin than a Mustang Mach-E. So depending on where you live, if you're in Portland or if you're in Denver or if you're in Maine, this may actually get longer real-world range than an all-wheel drive Mach-E, even though that could be rated up to 277 miles of EPA range because it doesn't use a heat pump. And as a result, it's going to be using 3 to 4 times the amount of power to heat the cabin as this model. Because Volvo hails from a cold climate, they have thought about what happens if things get really, really chilly, and this does have an auxiliary electric heating element, but it's not really going to be used that often. Keep in mind that unless we're talking about a heat pump operating on the surface of Pluto, they're always going to be more than 100% efficient, because they're not creating new heat, they're moving heat around. In colder weather, a heat pump can extend your range by 20 to 25% depending on the vehicle and the driving conditions, and that will apply even when temperatures drop well below freezing. And in case you're wondering, yes, the heat pump system in this vehicle doesn't just heat the cabin, it will also heat the battery to improve battery performance. Since I'm not at home, I haven't been able to test cabin noise, but likely this is going to get the same score as the XC40, perhaps a little bit quieter because the back end is a little bit more aerodynamic. It may result in a little bit less wind noise. I'm surprised, however, that I don't get more road noise with those 255s in the back. Oddly enough, Volvo does not give us much control over throttle liftoff regen in the C40. In regular drive mode, it's almost coasting. There is a little bit of throttle liftoff regen. If I put this in the one-pedal drive mode, it is a true one-pedal mode. It will take you to a complete stop and hold you there. Then it is definitely more aggressive. Of course, the most aggressive regen braking happens when you put your foot on the brake pedal, because this has a blended braking system. And that means this is very different than a Tesla Model Y. And this will actually regenerate more power into the battery when regenerating than a Model Y, because it does not have a blended braking system. When you put your foot on its brake pedal, it activates the friction brakes, and the only regen you get is the throttle liftoff adjusted in the center console. Putting your foot on the pedal does not increase the regen. In this, it does. Even if you're in the one pedal mode and you put your foot on the brake pedal, you will get even more regen into the battery. That's because this is capable of regenerating a ton of power into the battery with those 2 electric motors, and most people don't want to stop that quickly. If you want to get your hands on the new C40, head over to your Volvo dealer now, because these are in production and they will be on showroom floors very, very soon. The price premium for getting the sexier version of the 40 series Volvo is not very large, depending on whether or not you want all the bells and whistles. This starts at $58,750, that is $600 more than a comparably equipped XC40 Recharge, and that comparably equipped part is important, because a base XC40 Recharge, that is about $7,000 less expensive than this, but obviously you're not going to get all the kinds of things that you have seen in this model. If you equip the XC40 Recharge with the Ultimate trim, then it's right around the same price. How does this compare to its very close sister ship from Polestar? Remember that Volvo owns half of Polestar. That is their sort of tech-forward brand. $49,900 will buy you the base Polestar 2 with all-wheel drive, but again, you're not going to get the same kind of feature content on it that you get in this. Although it is worth noting that comparably equipped, the Polestar 2 does end up being a little bit less expensive. But it's also a different flavor of vehicle, and it's designed for a slightly different shopper. The Polestar 2 buying experience is quite different. If you want a Volvo, you go to a Volvo dealer and you buy this just like a regular car. If you want to do European delivery, Volvo offers a number of European delivery programs for various vehicles. I don't know if the C40 is in that program, but I suspect it probably will be at some point soon. You cannot do that with the Polestar 2 because it is not built in Europe. But aside from that, the two vehicles feel very different. The Polestar 2 drives like BMW tried to build a Volvo, to be perfectly honest. It has a great driving nature. It feels very German. This has a different feel to it. It is certainly a lot of fun, but it feels more like an electric Volvo. So if you prefer something that's a little bit more relaxed, a little bit softer, and definitely has a style and a feel of its own, then you want the C40. This also has more ground clearance than the Polestar 2. So if you want to do mild off-roading, you can do that in the C40, you can do that in the XC40, and again, you can't really do that in too much of the competition. The next nearest competitor to this, in my mind, is going to be the upcoming Genesis GV60. It's right around the same size as this. It's going to be right around the same price as this also. It's probably going to start around $55,000, but it will start as a rear-wheel drive vehicle without the kind of ground clearance that we find in the Volvo. Genesis has not revealed a ton of details about the GV60, so we don't know legroom figures on the inside, etc., but because that is a dedicated EV platform, it is likely going to be larger inside than this. It's probably going to be closer to what we see in the EV6 or the Ioniq 5. There's a pretty big variance actually in terms of interior dimensions between those vehicles, and those three are very closely related. It's also likely going to charge significantly faster than the Volvo. The Ioniq and the Kia, they charge at 260 kW peak charge rate, and the average charge is very, very fast. They'll go 10% to 80% in 18 minutes. This 10% to 80% is going to take about twice as long. So depending on how often you want a DC fast charge, that will really direct you in which way you should go. The Genesis is probably going to be more expensive, however. Rear-wheel drive, again, it's going to probably be around $55,000 perhaps or so. All-wheel drive, probably going to be several $1,000s more than that, and if you want the all-wheel drive that is faster than this model, then that's going to be even more expensive. The C40 is definitely quick. This is the fastest Volvo model that they have ever produced from the factory, with a 0 to 60 time of about 4.2 to 4.3 seconds. This is seriously swift, and it is faster than the XC40 Recharge. Of course, for my usual detailed comparison section, be sure and hit that subscribe button. I will dive into that just as soon as I can get this back at home and run it through my usual battery of tests, including official 0 to 60 times, 60 to 0 stopping times, charging tests, range tests, all that sort of good stuff. So again, hit that subscribe button, find me over at Facebook, Instagram, all those other social places, and I'll see everybody later.